good afternoon. Thank you for that nice introduction, Gretchen. So, as she mentioned, my name is Johanna Blume. I'm the new curator of Western Collections, and I'm very happy to be here. It's been a wonderful first few months. Very glad to be here, really liking Oklahoma so far. Everybody's been asking me that. It's been good to me so far. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about landscape painting in particular, but landscape art a little more broadly in the Western genre, and then specifically about Wilson Hurley and how he kind of connects to that tradition. A little bit about me, since I'm new here to the institution and new to the vast majority of you. So I was originally born in DC and grew up going to the Smithsonian, fell in love with museums very, very early, going to, all of the Smithsonian Institution museums and the National Gallery, very early love of history and art and all of those things. But moved to South Dakota when I was 12, and that's really home to me, and had an early love of the West as well. As Gretchen mentioned, I have my bachelor's in American Studies from Knox College out in Galesburg, Illinois, and my master's in museum studies from the Cooperstown graduate program. And that both of those programs kind of fostered in me a real love of interdisciplinary approaches to various topics. So, my background is in American history and anthropology, Native American studies, art history, theater, literature, so I tend to take a very broad approach to museum work. I like to borrow from a number of different fields and disciplines when I'm looking at any new project. So that's something that you will probably see a lot of from me in future projects that I work on here at the Cowboy. I knew pretty quickly that I didn't want to teach, at least like in a classroom setting. So when I was thinking about sort of long-term plans, thankfully I had a really great professor and advisor who went, "Well, have you thought about working in museums?" And I went, "I love museums, that's a great idea." So the Cooperstown graduate program was a really great fit for me because it kind of contributed to that interdisciplinary approach by giving me sort of the broad museum toolkit, but still allowed me to focus on curatorial and research work, which is something that I really love. After my master's degree, I went straight to the Eiteljorg. I started as an assistant curator there, worked my way up to associate curator, and then in 2018 became the curator of Western art there, and spent 7 years in that position before coming here. So very excited, like I said, to be here and to be working with a new collection, a collection that I've admired for a long time, has some true gems in it. And excited to see kind of what new projects await me here. I kind of dove right into the Atherton reinstallation, which has been exciting to work on as well. Environmental history and landscape art have been something of a particular interest and passion for me throughout my studies and career. So this topic today, I was really excited when Gretchen asked me. She actually emailed me before my official start date to say, "Hey, do you want to do a Brown Pack talk in September?" And I was like, sure, I guess, cool. About what? And she's like, "Your pick." So I was like, this is something I feel comfortable talking about. This is a topic that I am particularly passionate about and interested in. So really excited to share a little bit more about this with you today. So let's see if I can figure out where, there we go. So we're gonna cover a little bit of early background just generally on landscape art and what we even mean when we're talking about landscape art. And then get into how that specifically connects to Western art, and then where Wilson Hurley kind of fits into that tradition. So to kick things off, well, first off, I should probably not have even advanced to this slide yet. What do you guys think landscape art is? Any thoughts on that? Like, what do you think would be in a piece of landscape art? Trees, okay. Mountains, the outdoors, rivers. So aspects of the natural environment. Any thoughts on what mediums comprise landscape art? Like how it would be depicted? Paintings on canvas, photographs, okay. Pencil sketches, all right. All right answers, but I think we can also push a little bit beyond that today, talk about kind of where landscape art started and maybe some interesting directions that landscape has gone since. So you'll see the title of my talk is Wilson Hurley and Traditions of Western Landscape Painting. We are predominantly going to be focusing on painting, but not exclusively. So looking at early developments in landscape, landscape as a subject matter, as a genre, really began in the 17th century. It rose out of an increasing focus on the backgrounds of historical subject paintings. So you saw this sort of increasing emphasis and attention to the background, natural sort of settings of these historical paintings, where more and more sort of detail and care was being taken to, like you said, a lot of these sort of natural elements that human figures were placed in, but less and less emphasis on those human figures. So this kind of led to its own genre that had sort of two primary approaches. There was the classical landscape, which kind of retained these roots in the historical genre with its connections to classical history and classical subject matter, very much rooted in sort of the Greek and Roman history. And a key proponent of this was an artist often just referred to as Claude, but Claude Lorraine, you'll often see him also referred to as, I'm going to jump ahead real quick, this is an example of his work. But the other primary style was naturalistic landscape, which was a bit more grounded in the actual observed environment and a little more rooted in connections to what the environment was like around a person, around an artist, and sort of what their observations were of nature. That said, it still had a very sort of not quite exaggerated, but like, and I'm going to use the word romanticized, although the Romantic movement had not yet occurred, but this sort of like heightened approach to the landscape. And this was in part looking at how the natural landscape kind of connected to aspects of the divine and could be an expression of, God on earth. And another important artist in this movement, the Dutch artists were particularly particular proponents of this style. Jacob van Ruysdael was somebody who painted in this style quite a bit. This is an example of his work. But this is all happening at the same time that the French Royal Academy began to classify and develop an actual hierarchy of genre. So this is establishing sort of an importance of different kinds of painting and different subject matters within art. And so landscape was actually placed fourth of five in this hierarchy. The hierarchy went historical painting, so subjects of historical scenes, that kind of thing. Then portraiture, then genre painting, which was sort of everyday life, a lot of sort of pastoral scenes, that kind of thing. Then landscape, and then still life as the last one, which is a topic in and of itself to talk about why still life was the fifth, given that it was the subject most frequently painted by women artists, but we'll save that one for another day. But despite its lower status in the hierarchy, landscape remained a really popular subject, and it just increased in popularity over time into the 18th century. But the classical style sort of remained predominant for a long time, but that began to change into the late sort of 18th century and then into the 19th century. So I'm gonna kind of speed through this so that we can talk about Hurley more at the end. So jumping ahead into looking at landscape traditions in the United States, one of the most important movements associated with this is the Hudson River School. So the Hudson River School rose to prominence in the mid-19th century. It became a really prominent American art movement, was wildly influential for a very long time. I mean, still to this day is wildly influential. Began in New York and was primarily focused initially in its early years on the Hudson River Valley in New York. So this is the Catskills, the Adirondacks, the White Mountains, kind of that whole area. It was highly influenced by and tied into the Romantic movement, which was an artistic movement that began in Europe towards the end of the 18th century. And the Romantic movement highly valued things like artistic subjectivity, not objectivity, subjectivity, the imagination, the value of nature. It was a response to increasing industrialization, the whole Industrial Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment. This was artists trying to hold on to the individual and using art as an expression of, kind of the individual's imagination and holding on to the beauty of what we as individuals can see in the face of, things becoming more homogenized and more industrialized and that sort of thing. So Hudson River School is kind of growing out of those traditions. But here in the United States and very much tied to the landscapes and natural environments of the United States, initially in the East. There are a couple of major names associated with this. Thomas Cole is generally acknowledged as the founder of the Hudson River School, but probably two of the biggest names associated with it are his student, Frederick Edwin Church. So we've got, do I have a little doobie kicking? No. I don't have a pointer thing. But anyway, example of Thomas, these are details of works, but an example of Thomas Cole's work on the far left, Church in the center here, and then one of Church's chief artistic rivals, in a name that many of you may be more familiar with because he's represented here in the Cowboys collection, Albert Bierstadt. So these are all, none of these are works here in the collection at the Cowboy, but I think you kind of see stylistically how they are cohesive and related and therefore kind of part of a similar movement. So looking then at how this school that began in the East then relates to art in the American West. So this popularity of landscape, it's tied to increasing industrialization. It's, people's interest in hanging on to something natural, something beautiful in the face of an increasingly industrialized world where, wild spaces are diminishing, where the individual is sort of being lost in some ways. So in the United States specifically, this all gets tied into westward expansion and the sort of, movement deeper into the continent, colonization of the continent. And then this belief, this sort of doctrine that evolves at that time of manifest destiny, that it's the American sort of divine right to claim and subdue the wilderness. And I think this is particularly interesting because it's like this weird dichotomy of ideas that the wilderness is somehow both a divine expression and this the beauty of nature being an expression of divinity and of God, but it is simultaneously something that we have a divine right to conquer. it's this interesting juxtaposition of ideas. So Bierstadt in particular becomes an important artist in the West at this time, but has many significant contemporaries as well. He travels west on many significant expeditions and personal trips, creates a lot of really important work. One of the hallmarks of his work, I think, is this sort of exaggeration of the environment. When you look at a lot of his landscape painting, the environment is heightened. There's this sort of grandeur and magnificence to the way the mountains are depicted, the quality of the light. These compositions are larger than life, like if you travel to those places at the time, and certainly today, they don't look like that in reality. He wasn't aiming to depict reality. He was looking to kind of capture this mood, to capture this emotional feeling and this sense of the divine. So, anyway, just got some examples of his work here. This is a detail of a work of the Yosemite Valley. And again, you see these like huge mountainscapes bathed in light, the grand quality of the light, humans often in minuscule stature in comparison to the environment, all meant to kind of underscore that sense of humanity paling in comparison to nature and God. So work you may recognize from the Cowboy's collection. Another great example of everything I'm talking about. This one has a little bit more of a human presence. I don't know that I would quite classify this one as a landscape, but I wanted to include it since it is familiar, to just kind of show all of those hallmarks of a Bierstadt painting. That sort of grand source of light that the emigrant train is moving into, the grand mountains to the right of the canvas, all of those kind of aspects, kind of underscoring all of those, hallmarks of a Bierstadt painting. So, I'm going to kind of wrap up landscape a little bit before we start talking about Hurley. So we've talked about Romanticism a little bit and how, this is rooted in these sort of emotional connections and individualistic connections to the natural world. But landscape continues to undergo all of these evolutions of style and thought and interpretation in medium and in style. So out of Romanticism grows Impressionism, which sort of loosens a lot of the what's the word I'm looking for? Like brushwork and is less concerned with sort of a realistic rendering of subject. Is more about the impression of a subject and more about sort of emotional connections as well. This is an example from the collection that you can, I believe, see in the gallery right now. And then modernism, which sort of further begins to abstract subjects, looking at, again, sort of deeper emotions and thoughts and sort of aspects of place and idea associated with landscape. You also then begin to see, as we move into the 20th century, things moving even further afield, particularly as relates to medium. The land art movement of the 1960s. I would argue all of this is still landscape. But it's just moving, outside of the 4 bars of a frame. So the land art movement, you see a lot of artists working specifically with new materials that interrelate with the physical landscape, like are deeply connected to a specific place and can only be experienced in that place. This is a work, I believe it's out in California, California or Utah, that are these huge concrete cylinders that are punctured with holes to create constellations. And they're specifically correlated to specific times of day so that you see the constellations inside of the tubes at that time of day. So it really can only be seen in that place and at those specific times of day. Otherwise, it ceases to function as is. And the work in the middle here is a piece called Sunboxes. And the artist has traveled this all over the country. I got the chance to see it when it was in Indianapolis. And they are solar-powered speakers, essentially, but they are tuned to a very specific note that then are powered by the sun in that space, so that every installation is completely different because it's entirely dependent on the weather conditions that day, the location that they're in, the time of day, but it creates this beautiful soundscape that is intimately connected to that specific location and landscape. It's gorgeous. You can find it on YouTube. You can hear some different locations that it's been in and the sort of song that it creates. It's gorgeous. And then the piece on the far right here is by native artist Truman Lowe. It's called Waterfall 99. This is a detail of it. It's much, much bigger. But it's like a giant sort of grid with this cascade of sticks creating a waterfall. And so I always love showing this one in comparison to some of those early Hudson River works, which so often depict waterfalls. But this is just like a different interpretation of a similar subject. So, where does Wilson Hurley fit into all of this? So, I have to say up front, I haven't always liked Wilson Hurley's painting. I always like to share that with folks because I think it's an important thing to acknowledge that, you know, you might look at a piece of art and go, really? That's what people like? You know, you may at first instinct, you know, not respond to something. But if you give it a chance and maybe get to know a little bit more about the artist, get to know a little bit more about the work, you might learn something that changes your mind. You know, I know a lot of people, for example, have some sort of visceral reactions to a lot of contemporary art, but when you maybe get to know a little bit more about it, you might change your mind. You know, I think it's good to always keep an open mind about art. It's meant to challenge. It's meant to open your mind to new experiences and things like that, and you just never know where you're gonna go. So for me, Wilson Hurley wasn't always my cup of tea, but I've changed my mind. I actually quite love his work now. And part of that was in getting to know more about his process and getting to know more about his thinking behind the creation of work and where he drew his influences and sort of where he fits into this larger continuum of Western landscape and landscape painting generally. I love this quote from him, specifically about the Grand Canyon, but I think it relates broadly to his approach to landscape. He said, "The Grand Canyon's appeal for me is emotional. It makes me feel glorious. It grabs me by the throat." And I think that is just so powerful, such a strong statement and expression of an artist's intent behind what they do. And I think when I first read this quote, that was like the beginning of the change for me, because for me, for a long time, I thought his work was too clinical and was too scientific. And I think that was in part because of how he had been explained to me. I'm sure, how many people are familiar with Hurley in here? I know he's a big deal here for good reason. A lot gets made about his process. A lot, people are very interested in all of the detail work behind his artistic process. But that work is in service of a larger emotional intent. And I think sometimes that gets lost. So that's why I wanted to lead with this quote that, for Hurley, there's an emotional intent behind all of his work. So Hurley was born in 1924 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He grew up in a number of different places. He lived in, for a time in Oklahoma, they lived in DC for a while, they lived out in New Mexico. His father was an important general, so they kind of hopped around a bit. But he had an early and lifelong love of both art and aviation, which I think is a really important aspect of his art. I think his love of aviation, his experiences as a pilot, his experiences in the military contributed significantly to his unique eye on the landscape. He spent, getting a little sidetracked in my notes. He attended West Point, where he studied draftsmanship. And one of my favorite stories about him is that he had this like very rigorous artistic training essentially at West Point. And one of the projects that he had was to create essentially like landscape drawings of specific locales based solely off of topographical maps. So they were just given those sort of aerial topographical maps of a location, but then they had to render them as landscape drawings just based off of these like scientific, maps and mathematical equations, and then were like graded off of how accurate those were. And I think that's a big part of what contributed to his ability then to understand the landscape, understand the precision of dimensions, of perspective, which you'll see is hugely significant to the final project here of the 5 triptychs in the SEC. So the project in the SEC, I love this photo because you go in the SEC and you know they're big, but then when you see them being moved in, you're like, oh, they're big. They're really, really, really big. So I love you can see the sculpture in the background. It's like, oh, okay. So in 1991, the Cowboy commissioned Hurley to create 5 panoramic paintings for display in the newly built Sam Noble Special Events Center. The 5 monumental canvases were designed as vistas of the American West, revealing the grandeur of spectacular landscapes. For Hurley, this was sort of like the culmination of his career. This was the project, right? Like this was kind of the thing he had been working to his entire career. He did so much work to prepare for this. It's really kind of amazing how much effort went into this and how much innovation came out of it. He spent time in Europe looking at a host of different historical examples of large-scale work, of murals and other sort of large-scale painting to understand how to work at this size. These suckers are 16 feet tall. They're really, really big. And when you're working at that size, you have to change your thinking because the scale of it is going to warp the canvas. Like you're not just painting on a regular canvas because it's just not going to hold up at that size. So he had to develop whole new ways of structuring the substrate that he was painting on in order for them to physically be installed. So he spent time at the Louvre, Versailles, the Palais Royal. I love this anecdote that he thought it would take 3 years, and then he was like, nah, probably more like 5. And then in the end, he actually completed the project, I think, like 3-4 days shy of the 5-year mark. I mean, he was a man of precision. So before beginning each monumental painting, Hurley conducted field research at each of the 5 locations he had identified for each of the project, each of the paintings. The subjects are in New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, California, and Wyoming. He used geological survey maps, call back to that study in West Point, composed preliminary sketches. He created color palettes to be used, all back in his studio in Albuquerque at the time. So here are some examples of some of the materials. We have a host of this here in the DRC, a wealth of information about the project. So on the left here is an example of one of these sketches and studies for, I want to say that's the New Mexico one. And then some of his color palettes. I love looking at these color palettes. There are so many of them, and they're just so rich. And he has detailed notes about the blends of paints that he was using to achieve each of them, what like part of the canvas they're meant to go on, you know, if it's meant for a particular part of the waves in the California scene, or a particular part of a sunset, or a particular part of the clouds. It's just such wonderful insight into artistic process. There are all sorts of small studies he did for different compositions, for things that aren't the final compositions of the 5 paintings. You know, some of these might have been to get color right, you know, to find which colors he wanted to use. Some might have been other compositions he was considering. There's a great one of looking down over what I would assume is probably Albuquerque at night, and you can see all of the city lights down below. Would love to know what a 16-foot triptych of Albuquerque at night would look like. That'd be kind of interesting. But another thing that's kind of interesting about his process is he worked with this meticulous grid system. And this was in part because of how he had to paint the final paintings. He would lay out the composition on this grid, and he did this for other work as well, but it was particularly useful for large-scale paintings. He would lay it out on this grid in order to get the perspective accurate, but then this would allow him, as he steadily increased the size of the work, to retain that perspective and retain those proportions over each increase of size, because he did the final compositions 3 or 4 times at different scales in order to make sure he was accurately increasing the scale of it up to that final 16-foot high composition. He had to actually create his a new system for working on the canvas. He created like this roller system of the canvas so that it was like attached to a roller at the top and bottom, and he could then just kind of crank the canvas up and down as he worked on the grid. It was just, you know, like rolled canvas on this massive system. And then he, you know, could just sort of like work on different sections as he moved through the piece. And then they were rolled into custom tubes that were then shipped here to the museum, and then rolled out on an aluminum substrate that was specially designed to then be installed in the SEC, and installed in a way that they could be removed, and that the canvas could be removed from the substrate should something happen, you know, in the future. He was always like thinking 10 steps ahead and thinking about what was the long-term life of these pieces. They found when they were adhering the canvas to the substrate, they actually had to try several different adhesives because they were having a hard time, given the scale of the piece, like finding something that would adhere smoothly and not dry too fast or too slow. And there's a story, there's a lecture that we have, filmed lecture of his that we have in the DRC, and he tells a story in it about not like the roller they were trying to use to adhere the canvas wasn't working. It like wasn't getting a smooth fix to it. So they got some college students to come, some like young women to come and like slowly roll across the canvas because it was like the right like length and weight of person to like smoothly and slowly and gently adhere the canvas to the substrate. So it's just wild things they did to get those pieces into existence. So looking at the pieces themselves, we have all 5 triptychs here. So here is the New Mexico suite. So Hurley's work fits into sort of these larger traditions of landscape work. He was inspired by the Romantic artists who came before him. You know, he worked in a realist tradition, but very much rooted in some of those ideals of the Romantic and, prior to the Romantics, the naturalistic artists who came before, who were looking to, you know, create these grand expressions of the natural world. You know, he had this very meticulous approach to rendering the landscape. He was, yes, very concerned with accuracy and creating a precise rendering of a place. You know, all of that's coming out of his background as an engineer and as a pilot, but it was all in service of capturing a mood, of capturing an emotion, and bringing the viewer into that emotional moment so that he could share it with you. And, you know, I think like anybody, he understands it's not going to be exactly the same for every person, but, you know, he was kind of doing everything he could to bring the viewer into this shared emotional space. And for him, part of doing that was rendering the place as closely as he could to what he saw and felt when he was there. And it didn't necessarily have to be exactly that moment, but it was sort of an amalgamation of moments, if that makes sense. So like this bit of cloud and this bit of mountain, this bit of light, but sort of, you know, capturing these iconic places and these iconic expressions of feeling. So we have the New Mexico suite and the California suite. Oh, come on. And of course, the Arizona suite. And the Utah suite. And the Wyoming suite. One thing, so I wanted to show all of these to you. Now I'm going to kind of back up so you can kind of see them all together. He wanted to use a sort of unified horizon. Do you guys see that as you go through? That's technically, I mean, this one always sort of strikes me as like the slightly odd one out, but not actually. Like there's still this horizon line here that unifies with the rest of them. So they create this sort of cohesive environment when they're actually installed together in the SEC, because they're all installed at the same height in the space. He had to actually do some pretty extensive mathematical work to adjust the perspective on these pieces to account for the height that they would be installed in the space. I don't fully understand the math, but it's really interesting to look at his calculations as he was sort of adjusting for, well, if the viewer's going to be standing X feet back from the wall and looking up at this sort of degree of angle, but I was standing at this perspective in the location, how do you sort of meld those two perspectives to adjust so that they're seeing the same thing I was seeing? Um, and then unify that across 5 different compositions. So I would love to have talked to him, because that is quite the mind, in my opinion. This one in particular, I think, is the real crowning jewel and masterwork in terms of all of that background effort, because you're talking about layers of topography between the viewer's perspective and the far horizon point. And he was painting from, I think, in here somewhere, actually. So, he had to then imagine backwards. So it's quite the feat. Another sort of thing that I think is really cool about this one is these trees on the far left panel are actually life-sized in the final painting. I think, they're 16 feet high. That's a life-size tree. So, anyway. So, yeah, come on, go back. Let's take one last chance to kind of look at all of these and appreciate that work he did. So, went too far there. So a final note on his approach to these works. He said, in order to work, murals need proper geometry that considers where the eye of the viewer will be and proper lights so the work is vivid. I tried to bring my procedures up to the standards of modern science. And I think, that blending of science and emotion is sort of, that's Hurley to me, to bring those two very different but still compatible approaches to the work. Yeah. Oh. So the question is about how Hurley got paid, or how he made a living. So he wasn't only an artist in his lifetime. So he had many careers before becoming a full-time artist. He was in the military. He was a lawyer. He was an engineer. He was kind of a jack of all trades before transitioning to becoming a full-time artist. And he was prolific before taking on this project. So he was secure before he took this on. I don't know the details of the financial arrangement for this particular project. I'm sure, like many artists, there was some upfront payment, as well as, the remainder on completion. Somebody else who's been here longer may know the full particulars of that, but he was a very, very successful artist before taking, you don't commission somebody who's green to do something like this. Yes?
You might have said this before I went into that, but did he get with the museum people and did they tell him what they wanted? Did he say, I have some ideas? How did these particular scenes come about? They're magnificent. I've seen them off the years, but how did they like these ideas?
I'm sorry, I missed that very last part.
How did these particular ideas come about for the final painting? Did the artist have these, or did the people at the museum say, we would like these types of scenery in these places for this?
So the question is about how the particular compositions and subject matter were selected. My understanding is that the museum commissioned him to do large-scale murals for the SEC. I don't think they dictated the subject matter. But, you know, it's Wilson Hurley. You're going to get a certain kind of thing from Wilson Hurley. He's known for his landscape. So, you know, I think there was a certain understanding that these would be 5 large-scale landscape murals for the space. But then, as I understand it, Hurley then proposed the final ideas. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes.
Had anything of this dimension ever been done anywhere before?
So the question is if anything of this scale had ever been done before. Not, to my understanding, not in this particular way. Hurley had done some other large-scale triptychs sort of concurrently. There's another large-scale triptych of the Grand Canyon that's actually at the Eiteljorg Museum where I was previously. It's not quite that big, it's just on canvas. It didn't require a special substrate or anything like that, but it's pretty big. I mean, it's probably from about here to the end of that TV, and yeah, probably about as high as this one. So it's big. It's really big. So I'm not sure if he did that one. Because that one's dated like 1991, I want to say. So like right around the time he got the commission for the project here. So I don't know if he was doing that as like a test case for the idea here, or if he did that one and the Cowboy saw it and was like, hey, do murals for us too. But I think the project here is kind of unique in that it's at such a grand scale, and there are 5 of them, and they required, you know, this special substrate. And I don't know of anything that's been done like it since. So they're pretty special. Yeah.
Can you go back to the last slide? Yeah. So it seems like the docents have told us little stories before on little special hidden things.
Oh, yeah.
Some of these, like there's a rattlesnake.
There's a rattlesnake in one, and Wilson and his wife are in this one.
Yeah.
And I'm terrible at finding them.
Top of the waterfall, just to the right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's very blurry here, but they're up there.
Yeah. Those are
and
fun little-
and then is there a mountain lion in one?
There's a snake in one.
Yeah.
Go back to the one when you're just at. It is. Is it right in here, Melissa?
Up center panel,
Is it the center
lower
panel?
left.
It's along the rocks. It's a snake that's kind of coiled up, sitting on a rock.
And you can really see them.
Yeah.
Get up close.
Yeah. It's so funny that is the case with these paintings, because for years and years and years, the docents at the Eiteljorg swore there was a mountain lion in the Grand Canyon triptych that we had there, and there's not. There's not. I swear there's not. But I think because they knew that there were little like hidden details in these ones, they were like, we must have an animal too. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but we don't. All right. Any other
I
questions?
have one other question.
Yeah, sure.
So doesn't the museum also have some Thomas Moran paintings that he did and showed Thomas Jefferson those years ago to make a national park? Is that Thomas Moran?
I'm looking to Helen and Melissa, who work in collections. I don't think, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
They may have been loans, maybe? I'm not sure.
30 years ago.
Be a little research project.
Yeah, we can look into that. Yes, back there.
Another question. When this was finished and they were hung in the museum, was there like a big grand nationwide, I mean, 'cause this was something that was pretty special. Did it get a lot of publicity, and was it a pretty big deal, or was it just mainly here in the state?
So the question is about what kind of festivities and celebration there was around the opening of the SEC and the premiere of the paintings. I'm not sure. That's a great question. Do you know Melissa? Yeah, okay, so Melissa, who is our registrar, was saying it was mostly local. I do know that they are very highly regarded within our sort of field, though, you know, other museums in our sort of niche often know about these and think they're pretty cool. And just as a little teaser, we are working on a little digital exhibit about the murals that will be installed outside of the SEC. There's like a little niche alcove kind of right across the entrance, right across from the entrance, that we're gonna do a little installation in there. Because the SEC is often unavailable because of special events and that sort of thing, we still want to have something available for guests so that they can learn a little bit more about them, see at least a digital representation of the paintings, that sort of thing. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully in the next month or so, that'll be available. So.
All right, do we have any other questions?
Oh.
Sorry, one more. Who did Hurley like as an artist? Like, who did you
Yeah.
admire or kind of?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I'm trying to remember the name of the person he studied under. And I am drawing a blank, but his primary, the person he studied under predominantly studied under, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I should have written this down and I am drawing a blank on the names, but he studied he had a pretty impressive lineage of teachers in his lifetime who were wildly influential on him. Just give me 1 second.
I just wonder if it was a New Mexican artist.
Yes, one of them was. I can find this super fast. Maybe. You know what? Can I get back to you? Just send you an email. Sometimes you need to do a little background research. Like, go look for something.
Any other questions? All right, ladies and gentlemen, Johanna Blume.
Thank you.